I mean, this is taken from a Royal Institute of British Architects quote, which is, they call it the way to do it, but this isn't necessarily the only way to design, construct and make a building, but it's kind of a useful way to kind of understand how you might go about doing that. So, so this is basically, these are the stages that you might go through when you're designing and constructing your building. So they're normally, when you speak to an architect or a builder, they might talk about 6 stages, 3 stages before getting a planning application, and then 3 stages after a planning application. You'll notice there are actually 7 stages here, but we often don't talk about this kind of first stage, or the last one is use. So actually that's you guys in your house, so we're not normally involved in that sort of stuff. So the 3 stages before putting in a planning application are to do with developing the brief, coming up ideas for the building, putting together concepts, and then actually making a submission at the end of this stage here, at the end of stage 3. And then the stages afterwards are to do with putting together technical drawings, construction information that allow your builder to cost the building, and then actually in stage 5 you're building the building. So the building of your project is actually only stage 5, and all of this other stuff is sort of planning for that point. On smaller projects you don't tend to kind of work rigorously within these stages, and you tend to kind of skip stuff and move along, but it is quite a useful way to understand things. So I thought I'd talk through a little bit more about what happens at each stage. Oh, can you use that one? So at stage 1, this is often sort of developing the brief and kind of coming up with some initial ideas, testing them against each other, and then by the end of this stage you're kind of hoping that you'll have a really well-refined brief, and then you'll be able to kind of move on into a design. So at the first stage in the office we tend to start doing little sketch ideas about proposals. They're very, very kind of rudimentary, but they allow you to test out your ideas. A lot of people come to us and they say, when I start my project, do I need to know loads about what I'm going to do or what I want? And the answer is kind of no, not really. But it's a good idea to have some idea about what you want to do, otherwise this stage ends up becoming quite lengthy. So if you're having to develop the brief and an understanding about what you want for a much longer period of time, then you end up spending quite a lot of time on this stage, whereas if you know a bit more, this can be a bit quicker. There is a disadvantage about knowing too much, however. If you know exactly what you want, often what happens is that you start off on a project and that idea that you have, that vision, gets kind of eroded and eroded and eroded, and what you thought was going to be this beautiful vision for your project ends up as something completely different. So it's getting a balance really at this stage. So stage 2, the second stage is to do with taking those ideas that you had, those high-level options, and consolidating them into a single design, so a single kind of sketch idea. And by the end of this stage, you kind of hope to have a design for your building, some idea of what it might look like. You probably want to have started thinking about who might be involved in the project. This is kind of assuming that you might have an architect guiding you, but you might need other people who will kind of help you put in a planning application for whatever you're doing, if you are doing a planning application. Yes?
Sorry, are you open for questions now?
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
I'm very much in this process, but I'm being heavily led by the groundworks and the drainage and all of that. So would you encourage me to create my plan first and kind of know where all of the problems are first? And then look around that?
I think the more you can plan before you get there, the easier. I mean, if you're getting on to the point where you're actually starting to build and you feel like there's loads of things which you don't know still, I think that's slightly problematic, because it could end up costing you a load more money.
That's what I'm going through in my head. I know there's this drainage here. Do I change my plan so that it's less, cost if I'm not spending so much money, or do I just say, I want to absorb that because I want that feature? So.
Yeah, I think it's just getting that balance. I think it's about putting everything on the table and saying what's the priority and figuring that out. before you start building it, rather than kind of think, oh, I'll figure that out later on.
Seeing a drain there. Oh,
Yeah, exactly.
more money.
So then after this stage, the next stage, which is stage 3, is kind of just preparing information for planning, for a planning application. So it's kind of taking those concept designs, figuring out all the stuff about the way that the outside of the building works, and then putting in your planning application at the end of this stage. I mean, all of these stages, you'll notice there's quite a heavy emphasis in the first 3 stages about getting a planning approval, and there are lots of projects where you don't need a planning approval. And so, for those projects, this process is still relevant, but it's slightly different. So then, once you've obtained a planning approval, or you've kind of sort of formulated your scheme, the stage after planning is to do with putting together technical information. So that's putting together information that you could send to a builder for costing, and eventually you could start building the building from. So by the end of stage 4, you should have a package of technical information, and you should be engaging with the builder, and then by the end of this stage you should have appointed a builder, really. So then stage 5 is construction, and probably obviously by the end of the stage you should have a built building, hopefully. It's not always the case that you have a built building, a completely built building. Sometimes you'll get to the end of the project and there'll still be things that still need sorting out, or you'll want to move in before it's finished, and there are kind of ways of doing that. But hopefully by the end of this stage everything's gone really well. You've moved into your house or your project or wherever it might be. And then beyond this, there's actually another stage, which is after you've moved in and after a certain period of time, you come back and you sort of check with the builder that all the little problems that there might have appeared after you've been living in it, like your taps aren't quite working properly, have all been fixed. So this is something that we do in the office, where we're kind of going through and we're checking all those little problems, and making sure that the builder's kind of rectifying those things.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Is that you then being the project managers as well as the architects? Because if you've got
Yes.
issues with the building, you would go to the builders. But can you
Yes.
get the architects then back in throughout the process?
Yeah. So the architect's involvement, sometimes we get asked to do things up to just a planning application, and then people will take stuff to a builder, and the builder will take responsibility for everything. If we are, as an architect, continuing all the way through, there's a sort of split between things that are design-related problems, which would be an architect's issue, and things that are construction problems. So if an architect's drawn a drawing and the builder has built it slightly differently and it's leaking, that comes down to a builder. Whereas if an architect's drawn a drawing and the builder's built it that way, but the drawing is just wrong, that comes down to the architect. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So there's this sort of split, and it's not always completely clear cut whose responsibility something might be, and that's when you end up with kind of problems.
I suppose it depends on the project at what level you sort of hand it over to somebody, or rather, you hand it over to a builder.
Yes.
And when you get involved again, I suppose it's
Exactly.
dependent.
So
Does it often kind of get agreed before and kind of costed? Because obviously, you cost money, as in you make charges on that. And I suppose going back and asking, I suppose if you wanted to do something extra to the building, that would be design, and they, that would be expected that you would.
Yeah, and I think it's worth speaking to an architect at the beginning and saying, this is our budget, this is how much we've got to spend. And actually, like a good architect should say to you, my fee would end up being so much of this if you took me all the way through, that you might not want me to do all of this. I might just do this set of drawings, and the implications of that are, you're not going to have that stage 4 technical design, for example. You're going to rely on a builder to do that work for you. I mean, we'd advocate for us doing that work, but it doesn't always work like that. And if you're just replacing some windows or building a really small extension, you might not need an architect all the way through.
Yeah. So it's good to have in mind when you're having that initial chat.
Yeah, I think if you can start the project and start talking about budget almost immediately, then you can set out who should be involved and how much they can be involved. On bigger projects, in fact, I'll move on to this. There's the next thing. Oh no. On bigger projects, you might have lots of people involved, whereas on a small project, you might want to just refine it down to only a few people, because you don't want to spend as much money on design fees as you do on the actual build. This was just a slide about, do I need planning approval? So as I said before, lots of the stages are based on getting a planning approval, and there are, based on whether the size and the location, the character and type of building, you might not need planning approval. And the planning portal, there's a good planning portal website for just checking on whether what you're doing will need a permission.
And is that location specific? So it'll say like put in your postcode or whatever, and then.
No, so it'll ask you things like what kind of building are you doing? One big thing, especially in Stroud, is are you in the area of outstanding natural beauty?
Yeah.
Because if you are, then there are
industrial heritage as well.
Yeah, so there's lots of other things, and it'll take you through all of those things, and it should give you a good answer. And then, if you're armed with that piece of information, you can go and speak to an architect and say, I've done this, I think I need planning permission, can you help me on this?
I've been on that website, it's really useful, because I was doing a garage conversion. I thought that would be simple, because it's sat in front of the dwelling, the garage itself.
Yes.
I had to then go through the planning permission.
Yes.
Crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's lots of little nuances like that you kind of need to check. It's called, the planning portal, it's like a national, yes, the planning portal, yes. It is, and it's where you submit a lot of your planning applications through that system, yeah. So this is talking about the people who might also need to be involved. This is a sort of list moving up to, these are the different stages down here, and these are all the kind of things that you might need for a planning application beyond. So you can see it's a huge list, and it can be quite overwhelming, the amount that you get asked for when you're doing a planning submission. So again, that's a good reason to speak to an architect or a planning consultant and say, what do I actually need? Quite often we see projects where they get submitted or they're going towards a planning application, somebody's come to us and there's more information that needs to be done, and that delays the process. Things like appointing ecologists, you can only do surveys at a certain time of year, and so that kind of... So talking about this stuff right at the beginning of the project is quite important as well. And then similarly, this is a kind of list of who else might be involved in the project. So we've got architects, structural engineers, quantity surveyors who might do costings for you. And again, for smaller projects, not all of these are going to be applicable. For a really small project, you won't really need a quantity surveyor. You could probably have a builder doing your costings for you. And there are kind of advantages and disadvantages of doing that, but it just makes sense if you don't want to pay too many consultants. And this goes all the way down to things like heritage consultants, planning consultants. And so it's a good idea to start discussing this with an architect or a planning consultant, somebody like that, to see who else you might need on your project. This is sort of this is a project where we're looking at who might be needed at different stages of the project. And we normally say that, the green ones are things that are essential, that you'll definitely need to do. For example, on this one, ecology, there needs to be an ecologist because of its setting. But for other projects, you might not need that. In summary, this is can be fairly complicated. Figuring out actually what you need for your project, when you might need it, who you might need involved in your project. So the kind of best thing to do is formulate an idea of what you want, gather together some images about what you think it might want to be like, and then go and chat to an architect and say, this is what I think I want, how might you be involved, what might the costs be, who else might need to be involved, and that's a good way to start. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Would you yourself take on a bit of a project management role in that, or do you stay isolated as the architect?
So In terms of, do you mean when you get on to building the building?
Exactly that.
Yeah, so I mean, and we tend to kind of like to be involved in building the building, and that's coming and inspecting what the builder's doing. I mean, it's always good to have someone independent from a builder coming and having a look and saying, yes, they are building what they're supposed to be building. It's the accountability, exactly. I mean, you don't, it's not a requirement to have that, it's just, it's a good way to check. And it's the same with the costs as well. You don't need a quantity surveyor, but then you're just relying on the builder saying, that's the price, do you want to pay it? Whereas if you have a quantity surveyor, they can say, that's not an acceptable price.
They're making 15% on materials.
Exactly, or something like that, yeah.